Welcome to UO Today. I'm Paul Peppis, Director of the Oregon Humanities Center. My guest today is Alison Gash, Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Oregon. Gash's research explores how policy advocacy mechanisms shape policy outcomes. She's written on various forms of legal and political advocacy with a particular focus on civil rights. Her book, Below the Radar: How Silence Can Save Civil Rights, was published by Oxford University Press in 2015. Prior to earning her PhD at UC Berkeley, she worked as a civil rights and anti-death penalty advocate in Washington, D.C. Thank you, Allison, for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
So your undergraduate degree is in art history.
The road for every political scientist, obviously.
What led to your interest in political science and public policy?
I was always interested in civil rights issues, in particular race issues, from a really young age. I was raised by my my grandfather, who had a real keen interest in imparting some of his values onto me. And when I took up art history as a possible subject in college, it was with an interest towards looking at issues of race and gender and sexuality in the context of art. And what I realized was I couldn't really do the sort of work that I wanted to do through that venue, although I'm very thankful for having that training. And so midway through college, I shifted my focus to political science, although I didn't do it from in terms of my major. And then when I graduated, I worked in civil rights litigation, in fair housing and fair lending in particular, and then also in death penalty advocacy. And so from there, it just made sense that looking at the sort of civil rights landscape through the realm of law and public policy was what was going to be my passion. So it made sense.
So what made you decide to move from working in DC in public policy to becoming a professor of poli-sci?
Well, so part of it stems from, when I was little, I always got the little comments on my report card: does not work and play well with others. And so I'm good as sort of an independent worker. I like to, I see myself sort of as a storyteller of sorts. I certainly loved working in policy. I liked the idea of fixing things, but there was a lot about it that puzzled me, and there was a lot about it that frustrated me, a lot of that inertia that we study, right, as academics. And I wanted the chance to be able to tell stories to other folks that had the capabilities and the patience to actually sort through that inertia. And I am also really interested in a lot of different perspectives on civil rights, and so it seemed to me that the academy, but also being able to publish my stuff in more journalistic sources, gives me the opportunity to look at those different vantage points and to ask a lot of different questions of the same sorts of subject matter, which I really enjoy.
So tell us about the premise of the book Below the Radar. What's the argument?
Well, it started from this really interesting puzzle. I was writing a paper about same-sex parenting, and this was right as the backlash against same-sex marriage was really prominent. And there was this really interesting article in USA Today that said that same-sex parenting was going to be the next big anti-gay movement. And then, in fact, there had been 17 states that were positioned as targets for anti-parenting initiatives. And the interesting thing from my perspective was that it never happened, right? Even though all of the arguments against same-sex marriage are about children's welfare. And so I created this conference paper that looked into some of the reasons why parenting does never suffer the same sorts of setbacks as the marriage stuff did. And what I discovered from talking to attorneys who dealt with same-sex parenting in particular was that they employed these below-the-radar strategies, that they were really cognizant of the possibility of backlash, and they specifically and deliberately used what I refer to as below-the-radar strategies to make sure that they didn't see the same sort of backlash that they saw with other anti-gay initiatives. And so that meant, using family courts. That meant not appealing decisions up to higher levels if they thought those appeals would garner some sort of, public acknowledgement or public light on those issues. And so what I started to realize was that these sorts of stories, these deliberate attempts to keep things below the public radar, were happening in other policy arenas. And that in general, the story about below the radar advocacy had been that it was about sort of advancing conservative ideals. And here we had this really interesting story about civil rights issues being dealt with in the same sort of, through the same sort of lens. And what I thought was particularly interesting about it was that what it responded to was this idea that courts and social change are sort of a controversial subject matter. There's a whole litany of literature that argues that courts aren't really much, prepared for dealing with issues of social change. But here we had, right, two areas, the group home area and then same-sex parenting, where we saw like significant social change being made, in particular because courts are really good venues for low radar advocacy.
Fascinating. So the Supreme Court strikes down the Defense of Marriage Act on June 26, 2013. So I'm just going to walk you through a couple of decisions, but describe the importance of that decision. Why was that an important decision? What did it do and why was it important?
I mean, that's an important decision because what it does is it sets up the possibility of the state-based bans on same-sex marriage being struck down as well, right? So what the court does in that decision is to argue that the fact of a ban on same-sex marriage is problematic, not just because it's a federal usurpation of states' rights, but also because there is a fundamental rights, right? There's an implication of a fundamental rights issue at stake in that decision, right? And so Kennedy really artfully carves out some rhetorical devices that lawyers can then use to combat these state-level bans, both in state court and in federal court. So what you see immediately after that decision in Windsor is the citing of Windsor in the striking down of these state-level bans, which then allows you to sort of circle back a couple years later, to eventually strike down all of those state-level bans, right? So it gets the ball rolling in ways that we hadn't really seen at the federal level.
Okay, so 2 years after the repeal of DOMA, the Supreme Court affirms in Obergefell versus Hodges that the fundamental right to marry is guaranteed to same-sex couples.
Yes.
So why is that important decision, and why has it proved to be insufficient?
So it's an important decision. Logistically, there were still lots of states that had these bans on same-sex marriage. For the most part, although public opinion has certainly, increased in support of same-sex marriage, the fact that these bans were struck down were almost exclusively, with the exception of a few states, almost exclusively court-delivered, blows to these bans, right? So courts have played a huge role. And so the fact that you have this federal decision, legitimizes those judicial efforts, But it also, logistically struck down those remaining states that had these bans. It also, psychologically, for kids being raised by same-sex couples, for kids who are identifying as LGBTQ, it gives them legitimacy, it gives them validation, it gives them hope. The psychological benefits that kids get when their parents can publicly state that they are married, when they can go to school and say, no, I do have two moms, I do have two dads, and they are married, that is huge in terms of what that does for their confidence, what that does for their stability, what that does for their emotional well-being. And so, there were whole hosts of benefits that emanated from that decision. And I also think that it invited, movements in other arenas that affect LGBTQ individuals and couples and families, So once you strike down anti-sodomy laws in Lawrence v. Texas, and then you can, make an argument for a set of positive rights in Obergefell versus Hodges, then you can start to really make claims about, the full benefits of citizenship that LGBTQ folks weren't able to make before that.
So, I think there was a moment where a lot of us thought, oh my God, we're there.
Yeah, right, exactly.
It's now everything is, and that hasn't in fact turned out to be. So what are some of the remaining, or what has happened since then that has created problems, or what are the unanticipated legal problems or strategies or things that we're having to find now?
Well, so one of the interesting things about the fight for marriage equality is that early on, you had these divisions in the gay community about whether that was a really good approach, And there were lots of people who were concerned about, these parenting rights. A lot of people were concerned about employment inequality. A lot of people concerned about hate crimes. And to a large degree, those things got shoved to the side, right, as we focused on marriage, right? And the hope, I think, among a lot of people was that marriage would then, right, give us all this stuff, right? And marriage gave us marriage, and that's great, and marriage gave us all the things that I just mentioned, but it didn't solve employment inequality, right? It didn't solve employment discrimination or hate crimes or any of those things, right? Those things are still happening, right? In fact, there were some studies that suggested that shortly after marriage equality in certain specific states, you actually saw an uptick in hate crimes, right? Because people were angry, or people, you know, or there were more people who were out, and so there were just more, you know, people being targeted. So we haven't dealt with those issues, and it's not clear that we have at least not we certainly don't have the federal support to deal with those issues, right? And so now we're having to deal with those issues piecemeal, right? So we have, under Obama, we had this great moment, right? We had this great bubble, right, where he enacted all of these rules and executive orders and policies, you know, inter and interagency policies, protecting LGBTQ folks from discrimination both in government and privately, right? He had the same stuff for transgender individuals. That stuff all got struck down, right? All gets removed, right, when you have a different president, right, in this instance, Trump. And so now we're sort of scrambling to figure out how to backfill the holes that are left right now that we don't have Obama holding some of that stuff together for us.
So you've begun to answer my next question, which is, you know, based on what has happened in the first 98 days of the Trump administration, how are you feeling about the prospect of LGBTQ rights? You've started to talk about that. So you know, what are these strategies that you're alluding to backfill, to respond to these executive orders that are striking down these policies?
So under Obama, you have this federal safety net, right? So even though there are lots and lots of states who are really antagonistic towards issues of LGBTQ rights, whether it be employment or housing or even marriage services, right? So just because you can get married doesn't mean you can actually get someone to, you know, take pictures of your wedding or even, you know, preside over your wedding. So lots of states that were providing a legal option for folks to opt out, right, of being decent human beings to LGBTQ folks. Obama provided a federal safety net, right, so that, you know, largely diminished the effects of these laws, right? Without someone like Obama in office, right, without somebody who really takes seriously the fact of these instances of discrimination, states have, you know, full reign to really carve out lots of different options for privileging discrimination against LGBTQ individuals. And those are aided in part by Religious Freedom and Restoration Acts, which are, you know, which we have at the federal level, and we also have state versions of them, which allow individuals to opt out of right, either non-discrimination measures or, you know, even potentially, right, marriage policies, if they feel like it violates their religious beliefs, right? And we're starting to see instances where employers are beginning to fire or not hire folks, in particular transgender individuals, because it violates their religious beliefs, and we're beginning to see courts uphold those rights because their RFRA claims are being validated, right? And so, you know, and so we're seeing states become more active and their efforts become more robust in minimizing and dampening the possibilities of LGBTQ rights coming to full fruition. And so now it's a liberal state versus conservative state kind of battle.
So obviously, you know, these court rulings, I mean, ultimately, it's conceivable that one of these is going to get to the Supreme Court.
Yeah, absolutely.
So first, let's just talk a little bit about Gorsuch's nomination and the debates that were surrounding that in relation to questions of civil rights. What were some of the debates that people were arguing about around his nomination?
Yeah, I mean, so, you know, the Gorsuch nomination it's loaded, right? It's loaded because of the process that was used, right? It's loaded because there was this nomination that didn't get considered. And so people viewed Gorsuch as being sort of unfairly considered for a replacement for Scalia. And then there's the separate substantive issues, right? The you know, in particular issues around Roe v. Wade, right, which is at, you know, sort of at the forefront of any judicial nomination, but also, right, concerns emanating from Trump's threats to remove, take down marriage equality. And so there's concerns that Gorsuch, being a Scalia-style judge, if given an opportunity to revisit some of these issues, would vote in the way that Scalia would vote, which, I think those concerns are valid because, of course, he will, right? There's no question, right, given his own particular read of the Constitution, right, given his own sorts of decisions that he's already made, although not specific to those issues. You can sort of glean his judicial philosophy. And so there's no doubt, right, that if given an opportunity to revisit any number of those civil rights issues, right, he would act in the same way that Scalia would act. And so I think the concerns from a civil rights issue are exactly those. It gets a little more complicated when you broaden that question to think about issues of checks and balances, because that's when Gorsuch becomes a more complicated figure, where he might be somebody willing to challenge the president on a number of issues, maybe that don't pertain specifically to civil rights, but pertain to executive power. And so that's where the story on Gorsuch hasn't been written yet.
Particularly because Trump is saying things about the judiciary that no president has ever since Jackson, right? That are just way beyond the pale.
Yeah.
And it's hard to imagine any member of the judiciary
being
thinking,
okay with that.
Yeah,
exactly.
Regardless of what their politics
exactly,
are.
exactly.
So how has you've already alluded to this, but how has his confirmation impacted your views about the status of LGBTQ rights and LGBTQ people in the U.S.?
I think, I think mostly what, it's like most progressives. I think we're just, I think folks are just crossing their fingers that the block of justices that voted for LGBTQ rights, that supported Obergefell versus Hodges, right, that struck down the Defense of Marriage Act, that those justices stay on the court, because as long as they do, right, we're preserving the Obergefell majority, right? So right now that majority hasn't been touched, right? And so as long as you can preserve that majority, right, it's likely that nothing will change, and that you will have a court that is willing to entertain a range of issues dealing with LGBTQ rights. But the issue changes tremendously, right? If one of those justices retires or, God forbid, passes away, right? Then we have a different constellation of concerns, right? One that dramatically changes opportunities for folks who want to strike down, right, some of those advances.
So I'm going to shift a little bit. Give us an update on what's happening with the so-called bathroom bill in North Carolina.
Apparently they've struck a compromise, and so now the bathroom bill isn't quite as egregious as it had been in the past. They've struck down some provisions that bled into other areas of LGBTQ rights. But what it has done, unfortunately, is it's licensed lots of other places, lots of other jurisdictions in other states to begin considering bathroom bills of their own. We also see, courts beginning to pick up some of these cases, and there being a real difference of opinion depending on which judge you get as to whether or not a bathroom bill or a bathroom policy can stick. So we've got, a district court in Pennsylvania striking down a bathroom bill or an anti-transgender bathroom policy that was created by a school, right? But then you've got another district court in another jurisdiction upholding a bathroom bill as being a perfectly fine and legitimate interest on the part of the state. And so, we're seeing this bathroom movement fluctuate a lot depending on judge and state, and the likelihood of Supreme Court intervention is pretty significant.
You didn't mention what seemed to me to be a factor was the boycott by these very powerful.
Huge.
And that seems to me to be something that could happen again.
It could, absolutely, it could. And so what happened in North Carolina was really critical, really important. You have, people from the NBA to Bruce Springsteen to, whole hosts of huge stakeholders pulling out of North Carolina, which created the push to compromise, right? Certainly it wasn't just, right, allusions to rights, right? But certainly it was a money issue, it was a tourism issue, right? The state lost, millions of dollars on this. But other states have done similar things and haven't seen the same kind of backlash, either because they weren't prominent targets for the sorts of investments that North Carolina typically is, right? Or because there was just a large enough conservative base in those states that it didn't prompt the same kind of protest. And so again, right, it speaks to the very sort of local, state by state, court by court nature of these bathroom bills, right? And the problem of Trump's rescinding of Obama's executive order with respect to protecting transgender bathroom rights, right, is that then, right, it elevates the possibility of these state level and even school board level fights with respect to bathroom access.
Why is it important? Why is the bathroom bill important? Why is that something that transgender people are fighting for? What's the value of it?
Well, so there are whole hosts of physical and psychological costs that transgender students bear when they are denied access to a bathroom, right? I mean, it's if you think about it, it is about as basic an example of dignity, right, as one could think of, right? If you can't use the bathroom of your choice, right? If you can't, right, exercise that very, very basic and fundamental right, you're not really regarded as a full human being, right? You're not being given the full dignity that is accorded to other human beings. And we know, statistically speaking, that transgender students, transgender individuals who are denied access to bathrooms or even hassled or harassed or physically harassed in their efforts to use a bathroom, right, are way more likely to attempt suicide, have much, much higher rates of depression and anxiety, have much, much higher rates of substance abuse because of their anxiety and their depression and suicidality, right? There's also, right, the physical problems that come from having to, delay using the bathroom, so urinary tract infections, kidney infections, those sorts of things. And then there's, right, and then when you're talking about the school setting, right, so, school's hard enough, right? I mean, the stresses of school are hard enough, right? But imagine having to balance, right, to think strategically about using a bathroom, right, in the context of having to sort through your classes and, social issues and what have you. And this is what transgender students are having to do, either scheduling classes around when they think they might have to use the bathroom, or making sure their classes are in an area where they can have free access to a bathroom. It's just a set of stresses that are really, really immense and that shouldn't befall any student.
You've already spoken early in the interview about why you went from working in public policy to being an academic. As an academic, however, you are someone who regularly publishes, as you mentioned, in journalistic venues, Washington Monthly, The Conversation, other places. Why is that an important thing for you to do? Why is that something that's important for you?
I think for what I do, which is about, the real world, right, for lack of a better term, right? It's about ongoing controversies. It's about real civil rights issues. I think that I'm in a unique position as a professor to look at a lot of different vantage points, to look at, right, things from a macro level, or to look at things from inside a particular issue. And so I bring a set of skills that other people don't have, and I have a responsibility to provide some of those insights to anyone who's willing to listen, right? Not just the 2 people who read my book, and not just the people who are paying to be in my classes, right? But to anyone who can open up a newspaper or a magazine and has an interest in wanting to learn more about these issues. And because I have an interest in telling these stories, right, and to intervening into these problems, and and trying to do right by communities that I think have been disenfranchised through no fault of their own, I think I have an obligation to make those facts known to as wide an audience as possible. And thankfully, I work here, right, where the institution allows me to do that.
You just mentioned your classes, so let's talk a little bit about that. Tell us what you teach.
So I teach, not surprisingly, a lot of courses on civil rights and the law. So I teach a gender course, a gay rights course, a course that deals broadly with issues of difference in the law stemming from race, disability, income, sexuality. I also teach a course on the Supreme Court, which was really fun to do winter term of this year, because every day was a new discussion on stuff Trump had done to the court, or will be doing to the court. I also teach some intro-level courses that deal with legal institutions and their influence on American public policy, and also another intro-level course on issues of inequality in sort of American public policy.
From where you are teaching,
Mm-hmm.
how are you feeling about the political engagement of the generation that you're teaching? How are you feeling these days?
You know, I'm actually feeling, and this is not normally a word that I would use to describe myself, but I'm feeling hopeful. And if any of my students are watching this, they will be laughing because I'm never hopeful. But I really am. I've been just impressed with how remarkably strong the students in my classes are when faced with a tremendous amount of uncertainty, a tremendous amount of political unrest. So many things that they were taking for granted have now been sort of thrown up in the air, ranging from, the safety and health of their environment to their civil rights, right, to a whole right to just the basic safety of the West Coast with respect to North Korea. So I think they are really strong, really resilient, and really earnest about figuring out ways where they can intervene and they can problem solve, right? I've got several students who are thinking of running for office, local office. I have several students who are interested in law school not because that's the thing you do, but because they are committed to issues dealing with undocumented immigrants, and they want to be available, right, to be deployed in whatever court they need to be working in order to help those families out. I have lots of students who didn't have an interest in public policy before who are now super interested. And then students who just didn't realize that the stuff that we had been talking about in class were relevant, are now realizing how relevant and how precarious those things are, and are now really driven and really committed to figuring out a place for themselves.
And you're experiencing this across the political spectrum.
Yeah.
You're teaching students who are Trump supporters and
Yes.
students who are Hillary
Yep.
supporters, and you're seeing this across the board.
Yeah, so what's been really exciting for me is when I've got Trump supporters and Hillary supporters and Bernie supporters and non-voters in my class, we're all able to have conversations across those differences. We're all able to sort of look at the empirical landscape that's been presented by Trump and to evaluate it with all the skills that we're able to marshal, right? Absent ideology, absent partisanship, we're able to actually look at these things and have really profoundly sophisticated conversations about them in ways that I'm just not seeing echoed anywhere else. And so it's been really great to see that.
Well, we've come to the end of our time. On that very hopeful note, I want to thank you, Allison, for speaking with us today.
Absolutely. Thank you again for having me.
We've been speaking with Alison Gash, Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Oregon. Thanks so much for watching.